Let's get started. Behavioral ecology today, broadly speaking, some of which we'll introduce here in the outset, is really ethology, the study of animal behavior, not technically behavioral ecology, if you're splitting hairs, but we're introducing behavioral ecology through a history of the study of behavior. And this history of the study of the behavior is a history of the study of animal behavior. A headline was in the news last week about, and it was a splashy international headline, simply because it was a description of behavior in an alga, in a marine alga, as it avoided predators. And all the news articles called it a plant, this alga, and they said behavior shown in a plant. And that was considered internationally newsworthy. It was a really nice study. I did look at it, and a great study. But it is really newsworthy for a lot of people because we don't think of non-animals having behavior. So I want you to try to wrestle with what is behavior as you move through these lectures and the rest of the course. We'll be talking primarily about animal behavior, as most of the study has been conducted on animal behavior. And our definitions of behavior have centered around what animals do. Even your book defines behavior something like the series of actions, the series of muscular actions that follow as an environmental stimulus. Muscular actions. Well, your little marine alga is certainly not going to have muscles or a nervous system in the sense that animals do. So if you define behavior narrowly that way, then you exclude a lot of organismal activities in the process. Okay. Animal behavior, we'll look at causes and explanations for animal behavior. And we'll introduce that by looking into the history of the field a little bit. Behaviorism and ethology. Ethology, just a word for, really it's going to mean animal behavior, a particular type of approach to the study of animal behavior. Behaviors, of course, may be innate, instinctual, or learned. And that's the old nature-nurture divide and discussion. And then we'll give a definition for behavioral ecology and look at examples of optimal foraging, which fit well under behavioral ecology. What in the world is that? Sorry about the jackhammering on Friday. Went out there after the lecture. They started jackhammering about 10 of them. I said, guys, did you know we were having a lecture in there? Because they were hammering right outside the door. And they said, oh, we're done. Don't worry about it. I said, thanks, we're done too. There's a lot of construction going on around the building, so hopefully they don't start again today. We'll look at social learning, teaching. What can technically be understood as teaching on the part of parents in relation to their offspring in the context of culture and tool use, and thereby form a bridge from non-human creatures to humans and hominids. The scientific study of animal behavior. These three guys, von Frisch, Lorenz, and Tinbergen, what they pioneered has come to be known as ethology. They received a Nobel Prize jointly for their work on animal behavior. The roots of the study of animal behavior go back much further, and the formal scientific study of animal behavior, a decent starting point is Pavlov, who is sort of a household name, right? Pavlov is. On the basis of his study of the response of dogs to stimuli. He noticed that a dog in his lab would start to salivate when the trainer who would normally feed the dog would enter the room. And from that, he performed those series of experiments, which we all know about. We link it to ringing a bell causing the dog to salivate because Pavlov had conditioned the dog to associate the ringing of the bell with feeding time. He also used metronomes and various other stimuli to link to that expected reward or the food. And that was really one of the major studies that launched behavioristic types of approaches to animals. The field it really started to diverge between really mechanistic approaches that saw the organism as just strictly a set of behaviors and more psychological approaches that tried to address the mentality behind behaviors, and then this sort of middle way that the ethologists took by setting their studies in an evolutionary context and treating the organism complexly as both a set of behaviors with also some kind of subjectivity. Some of the ethologists would recognize that there was a subjectivity on the part of the organism as well that went into play, and that allowed different types of explanations of learning. But one thing the ethologists did really well, I'm getting a little ahead of myself, one thing the ethologists did well that people like Pavlov didn't was set their studies in the context of the natural systems in which the organisms evolved. So their approaches weren't entirely laboratory-based, which is to take an organism out of its evolutionary natural context. Rather, they attempted to study organisms in the wild, in their natural conditions. But there were many different fields and approaches, and Pavlov launched this series. Check this out. Did you hear about this study just last year, where a psychologist performed these series of studies with money and fast cars and showed that he could get these young male students in particular to salivate when they saw such things by having a reward associated with showing these objects. In the case of the money, he performed a study where he had people assume a position of either highly powerful position or a position of low power, and those who had assumed a position of low power psychologically were led to salivate when they saw money. Or the individuals, the males that took part in the study that were led to believe they might get a date with someone whose photo they were shown, when they saw a car, they started to salivate because apparently the possibility of a reward like a nice date would incline you to salivate over something flashy and expensive and exciting like that. You can read the study here by clicking that. It's an interesting piece of work 100 years after Pavlov, 130 years after Pavlov. Much of this research gets into the psychology department, and yet we're talking about organisms that also belong in the biology department. So much of this work is a nice interdisciplinary activity between psychology and biology. Tinbergen is one of those three, and I'll be going through their studies now, their most famous studies. One of those three who really set the standards for the field. This was also at a time when Freudian ideas were so popular, and Freud's theories were so much based on anecdotes, many of which he just heard from patients, whereas Tinbergen was out there doing concrete experiments that had results that were repeatable. And they both had very profound influences, but many people looked at Tinbergen's results as having more clarity because they were based on experiments. And one of the experiments he performed in establishing this fact of fixed action patterns on the parts of organisms was with gulls and their chicks. he noted that the chicks would, even if they had never been introduced to the parent before, even if it was a different parent, not related to them, they would peck at the parent's bill. And he performed experiments that showed that this pattern in this relationship, where the chick would peck at the bill and then the parent would be led to regurgitate food, was associated initially by the red dot on the parent's bill. He performed a simple experiment where he used a model of the parent as a control, a model that was shaped like the parent's head with the red bill, and looked at the pecking response in relation to that model. And he set the baseline with that control at 100, and then tested other models that were somewhat differently shaped, but also with a red dot, or a lifelike model without the red dot, and found that the model that was not lifelike but had the red dot elicited more pecking responses, whereas the lifelike model without the dot elicited much fewer. So he suggested that this dot, and particularly the contrasting pattern there, elicited such a response. He also performed the test with a lifelike model with the red dot and found a very high response rate. So we refer to these as fixed action patterns on the parts of the organism. There are a series of actions, more or less complex, that get released by particular stimuli, and they tend to be invariant. So the pecking at the bill or the regurgitation of the food, you can't really teach the animal to do that differently. It's fixed innately in some sense. He also performed these studies with wasps that influence the way we think about the way organisms orient themselves in their habitats. You may have heard of these. These are pretty famous as well. Wasps, and you can see this on campus. There's the path through the redwoods. Last year, there was a wasp that was living out there, and I would walk and watch it almost every day. It was doing its thing. It had a hole in the ground, and it was bringing caterpillars and prey back to its hole. And you can literally do this here in Berkeley. And it's a bit cruel to the wasp because you are toying with the wasp, but hey, it's not that bad. What he did was he wanted to understand how a wasp can find its little hole in the ground, which seems to be a nondescript little hole in the ground. And he, through his observations, and this is hours and hours of just sitting there and watching these things, very childlike behavior almost, of being really a patient observer. And he noticed that the wasps seemed to be queuing in on landmarks, on features of the area that were near the hole that they were seeking. And so he set a series of pine cones around one of these holes and surmised that the wasp would be orienting on the basis of those landmarks to find its hole. And then he moved the pine cones and when the wasp was away and watched what the wasp did when it came back, and sure, it went to the middle of the pine cones and stomped around looking for its hole, altogether confused. And on that basis, this was a launching of the whole field of the study of cognitive maps in organisms and how organisms orient in their habitats. Think about an organism like this, our fantastic gray whales that migrate along the coast here. And you can go out to the coast in a few months and see these whales as they plow south, seeking their winter range down here off Baja, where they will go to mate and give birth. And then they will return after a few months and head all the way back to the Arctic for feeding when the krill is blooming and there's so much food. And then they'll do it again, year after year. It's a tremendous migration. Well, how do they know where they're going? Some people suggest that they hug the shoreline as they migrate and use landmarks on the continent to orient them. It seems pretty simple to me because we know from other organisms that they use a lot more subtle cues in their migrating, including solar cues, including cues related to the magnetic field, a whole variety of cues, odors. But this may be a case of an organism migrating on a great scale on the basis of visual landmarks, in part. No doubt it's more complex than that. Did they learn that? Let me just step back a second again. Did they learn that from their parents? Because when they travel down, the pregnant females, having been impregnated here the previous year, give birth. And then they start this northern migration. And the babies travel with the moms last. The others go first. The pregnant females go first, then the big males, then the juveniles, and last, the new moms and their babies. And that's what's fun to see when you go out there in April, because the moms and babies stay really close to the shoreline, presumably to avoid the killer whales and the great white sharks that are offshore that want the babies. But they're also moving so close to the shoreline that people think maybe the babies are starting to map on to the features of the shoreline. In that sense, they would be learning how to orient during their own lives, right? But we also know that some aspects of migration are innate. They're genetically based. They're inherited. And this study, a rather remarkable study from a few years ago by investigators in Germany, showed that quite well. You can click it here if you want it. These are warblers. These are a little songbird that lives in Europe. Well, about 50 years ago, they started to, instead of migrating for the winter to points to the south, including Spain and I believe North Africa, a couple populations started to migrate to Britain for the winter. And that was new. They had never migrated that way before. And then they started to spend the winter there. Apparently because there was so much good bird seed that people were putting out, there were resources there that were available to them, and they started to take advantage of that. One population, or a couple of populations of this species, whereas the rest of the species was migrating south, or southwesterly. So what these investigators did was they went and took birds from Britain that were wintering there, brought them back to Germany, and raised them there, and also collected some of the birds that were in Germany that were flying south, and raised their eggs in captivity, in cages. And when the migrating season came, they put them into this apparatus and watched how they oriented, because this scratch paper would pick up the clicks of their claws as they moved. And so they could tell how they were orienting in their attempted flight patterns by describing the distribution of scratch marks around the apparatus. Were they orienting to the west, or were they orienting to the south or southwest? Well, the birds they collected in Britain were orienting to the west. And that's what you see here. The offspring of the British adults had that type of orientation, whereas the offspring of the German adults were orienting in that direction. So no one taught those little birds that they hatched out of eggs in their controlled conditions how to migrate or where to migrate. It was built in. It's still complex. We still don't know how it's built in exactly, but it seems to be innate. And that's a great example of that. An example showing that innate evolution, the evolution of that innate behavior must have evolved in the last 50 years, because it was only since the 1950s, that birds were even going there in the winter. If that's fast, I don't know. For Darwin, that would have been extremely fast. Darwin's sense of the temporal scale of evolution was different than ours is now. He thought of these long, drawn-out periods of evolution, whereas we see many more examples of relatively rapid evolutionary processes like that, if 50, 60 years is rapid. Konrad Lorenz is a beloved figure in the history of ethology, partly because of pictures like this, where he's shown on his farm being followed by a bunch of goslings or something. It shows him as the avuncular old scientist who everybody likes. He was actually a really great thinker, wrote a lot of books, popular books, scientific popularizer, nice writer. You can still find his books at Moe's on the used bookshelf. Imprinting is something that he studied. He showed that there are these critical periods or sensitive periods in the life of an organism during which they are exposed to certain stimuli that impact their behavior in a very strong way. And he showed this with ducks and geese, where during I believe it's just a handful of hours after their birth, when they're exposed, whatever they're exposed to, whether it's Conrad himself in his waders or inanimate objects even that are moved around, the young birds will imprint on those objects and follow them as if they are their parents. It's to the benefit of these little birds to follow their parents through a complex habitat to avoid being eaten or lost. So there's a survival value to this imprinting behavior. And he found that it was the waders themselves that they were imprinting on. He could put the waders on somebody else and they follow that person. Waders are just these rubber pants that you use to walk in water, right? And it's been shown, I haven't read much on this, a couple papers, about how human babies imprint on the voice of their mother in the womb. So they've done studies of babies in the womb and how they respond to the voice of their mom on a recording versus the voice of someone else on a recording. And they respond with their heart rate goes up and other physiological aspects of the little baby change in relation to the mother's voice. And so imprinting on the mom may start even in the womb for a human baby. And people always ask me about that, about what other aspects of imprinting are known from humans. I don't know of many others, but it's a really interesting topic. So if you know others, you can tell me. One way that the phenomenon of imprinting is being exploited for conservation purposes is in relation to some endangered birds that migrate. These are some type of crane that needs to migrate as part of its life history, but because they're facing extinction and their migratory paths have broken down, and in some cases these birds have been reared from eggs in zoos and then brought out to the wild, they need to be taught how to migrate. So they can be made to imprint on a plane, some kind of flying object, and they will follow that object on their migratory route. And it's been shown to work in a couple of cases where they imprint on an object that teaches them how to migrate. Cool use of biology there. Now, I haven't watched the various penguin movies that have come around over the last few years. You probably have seen one or the other. But you know how chaotic these colonies of penguins can get. How do they find each other? How does the parent find its offspring after it goes out foraging and returns? Well, one of the ways, what I want to impress upon you is that it's a very complex field of relationships, how these things function and work. But one ingredient in a case like this seems to be odor, simply smell. There are very strong cues, and this was novel, this recognition of odor, the use of odor by penguins. It was a pretty novel insight last year because birds weren't thought to rely that heavily on odor. They're such visually oriented and auditorily oriented creatures. But they're also relying on smell to figure out who they're related to. So they can smell their kin and distinguish kin from non-kin by odor. Whereas they might return to the colony area on different cues, use even different cues to orient on a mid-level scale to get themselves into the part of the colony that's appropriate, and then they can fine-tune via odor to find their actual offspring. And surely they're using auditory cues simultaneously because those birds are quite noisy. Mechanosensory communication. Think of this as like direct contact, but also visual observation. Now this is, I'm not sure what's more remarkable here, that honeybees do this or that von Frisch figured it out, because it's just unbelievable what these bees do and what it must have taken in terms of his observation, himself and his students over the years, to figure out how honeybees communicate where food is when they get back to the hive. What honeybees do if there's food nearby is they perform a round dance like this, in a pattern like this. And apparently that indicates, well, there's food nearby, like really nearby, less than 50 meters away, something like that. And they'll get back to the hive. Now, this is a vertically oriented hive, right? The comb is like this. So it's a vertical. And they're doing this dance on the vertical. And they come back, and the other bees are all excited because someone's returned, and they obviously have food or smell like food. And so they're watching, and they're feeling them with their antennae. And they know that there's food nearby, and they go out and look for it. But if the food is somewhat more distant, then they perform what's called a waggle dance. Click this for a video that shows it in all its glory. What they'll do on this vertical is perform this waggle dance of this nature. So it's a figure eight. They'll go around, and then they'll go on the straight line, and they'll waggle their butt back and forth along the way. And the angle at which they perform that straight line waggle in relation to the vertical is the angle of the food in relation to the sun as it forms a point to the land. That's insane. 40 degrees, if it's 40 degrees off the vertical, then head 40 degrees off the sun, the point where the sun meets the earth. And well, how far do you go? How do you know it's 1500? Well, it depends how long I waggle for. Because the distance to the food source is related to the duration of the straight run. And so it gets back, all the bees are buzzing around it, all very excited, receive the information, and off they go to exploit that same food resource. And so you're at your picnic, and you have your peanut butter and jelly sandwich, and a bee shows up, and then all of a sudden there are 10 bees there, right? It may be a form of this occurring, where they've communicated exactly where your sandwich is back at the hive.